So welcome to today's Bridges-2 webinar. This means welcome to the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. Here's who we are for those of us who don't know us. So we are a joint center of CMU and Pitt, high performance computing since 1986. Accomplished a whole lot, hope to accomplish a lot more. And in particular, this webinar is under the auspices of the Bridges-2 project. Bridges-2 is the system that Sam is going to be talking about. That's where he did at least part of his work. So that's why we're so happy to have him talk about his progress on our system here. I'm Sergio. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our leadership team for the Bridges-2 project, pictured here. And this is part of our Bridges-2 webinar series, which is a forum for the Bridges-2 community to learn and share ideas and achievements. If you follow that link, you'll see like the past webinars that we've had. Each of the webinars, including this one, of course, a couple of days after the fact, will have a recording. That's why I just agreed to that you're okay with recording. So there'll be a recording of the session. There'll also be Sam's slides. But we're always interested in ideas for new topics and speakers of interest. So if you have somebody in mind that is using Bridges-2 and that who you think might give an interesting talk, and of course, if you yourself want to be a speaker, just email me at this address. So here's a brief intro to Sam. These are his words. I guess you'll basically see what he's up to based on his talk. Just a few logistical aspects here. So first of all, we do have a code of conduct, which we actually share with the organization that allows like 90% of our folks to use us. That's Access. So nothing surprising there. But if anybody has, an issue regarding that, just drop a note. Just drop me a note again at the address that I gave you. Technically, what's going to happen is all of us except Sam will be muted during his presentation. So please type any questions that you might have into the Zoom chat. Now, some of them, especially of a more general nature, we might just be able to answer like in real time. But other than that, Sam will end like maybe at 10 to the hour, and then there'll be some time for him to answer the remaining questions. And then maybe if Sam agrees, then maybe he can provide an email address where residual or follow-up questions can be asked. So with that, does anybody have any questions for me before we get to the good stuff? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And Sam, if you want to try to share your screen.
Cool, let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay, how does that look?
It looks good. Does it look good to everybody?
Yes.
Cool. Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to say thank you so much to Sergio and the Bridges-2 team for inviting me to come talk today. It's also just such a fantastic team to work with. I really enjoy working on the Bridges-2 system, and the support team is really amazing. They handle all these technical headaches that I would otherwise spend way too much time on, and I get to kind of do what I think is the fun stuff. So thanks to the Bridges-2 team. Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little bit about work today from the Kitzes Lab at the University of Pittsburgh. So we consider ourselves what we call a bioacoustics lab. So we're using sound to study nature, and really what it comes down to is developing novel technologies that apply supercomputing and machine learning to try to discover some hidden patterns in nature that we wouldn't otherwise be able to discover just through direct observation. So I've changed the title from the original title to something a little bit more fun: Peeps, Pops, and Petaflops. So how can we turn audio data through some computing into some interesting ecological observations? So the motivation for all of this, of course, is that we're in the midst right now of a massive biodiversity crisis. And maybe you've heard of this. There's a lot of news. Every day, every month, we get some news about some species that is declining or some taxa that are declining. Biodiversity is really being lost as we speak, and it's due to a dizzying number of threats, right? There's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's diseases that are spreading through human vectors. It goes on, and there's always something around the bend. Um, and really, in our lab, the way we think about this problem is that conserving biodiversity isn't just about caring. It's not about just kind of slowing down progress of humanity or keeping our hands off nature. Preserving biodiversity really is going to take decades of hard work of a lot of people working on policy, on innovative solutions, really on all aspects of our society, and especially leveraging technology. So preserving that biodiversity isn't about limiting the applications of technology or development, but really turning those around and finding ways to use technology to better understand and protect nature. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the many ways that modern technology like AI and supercomputing and remote sensing are being leveraged to help us improve our understanding of the natural world and ultimately try to protect it. And what I'm going to talk a lot about today is sound. So sound is used throughout the animal kingdom by many different species because it carries rich information. So the frog on the left of the screen is blowing out its vocal sac to produce a sound to let other frogs in the area know it's present. I'm the same species. I'm looking for a mate, and I'm a strong male. And the lion in the middle is advertising to other males that this is his territory, right? And the little baby birds on the right of the screen are begging for food from their parents. And so they're saying, I'm hungry, come and feed me. And sound carries these messages and many, many more. So there are many different types of sounds that we'll hear that each are carrying distinct piece of information. And in particular, our lab spends a lot of time studying birds and the sounds that birds make to advertise their presence to females and to other males is a really fundamental aspect of bird behavior. A male songbird like this chestnut-sided warbler here that's singing in Pennsylvania will spend its entire morning doing this very energetically costly, seemingly meaningless task of singing its song into the morning. So we know that song and vocalizations are really important to wildlife. But how do we use that to better understand what's happening in nature? Well, one of the keys to kind of starting to understand the decline of a species or the health of an ecosystem or the interactions of perhaps native and invasive species is to first just understand where in time and space these species are occurring and how they're interacting. And a very effective method for many species that make sound is actually to use their sounds to localize what parts of the habitat they're using. So in our lab, we use acoustic sensors, and there's a picture of one of our little acoustic sensors in the middle of the screen here to systematically sample biological sounds in the wild. And the reason that this is really a revolutionary technology is it allows us to expand from just what one person can go do, survey, for instance, a bird community one morning in one place, to really scale it up in space and time. So we can deploy a little recording device, leave it out in the woods for an entire season, and maybe put 500 or 1,000 of these spread across the landscape so that we can capture all these rare events at a huge temporal scale. And another advantage of this, what we call remote sensing technology, that is capturing data while we're not around, is that once we get this data back, they serve kind of like a museum species or a museum specimen, and that we'll have this data on a digital record, and it's created this digital audio file that we can analyze in the future for different questions that we haven't even thought to ask yet. But that strength of this digital specimen also presents a very unique challenge, which is that unlike a human who went out into some area that they wanted to study and took notes on the species that were there and what they were doing, this audio moth recorder that we've pictured here, all it collects is really thousands and millions and tens of millions of digital bits. So this is a digital audio file that really to the computer is just a series of zeros and ones, right? It's a digital file and it doesn't necessarily have biological significance. And so we have to do something to process all of this data. But you can imagine if we've put out 1,000 devices for an entire season, we now have tens or hundreds of thousands of hours of audio recordings. And we don't have tens or thousands of hours to go and listen to all of these audio recordings. So this is where really that synergy between acoustic monitoring and machine learning is going to come in. So acoustic monitoring is this powerful way we can monitor wildlife. But to really get any useful information out of this scale of data, we have to have automated approaches using machine learning and AI and supercomputing and other modern technologies to extract some useful information that will help us learn about what's in that audio data. So how can machine learning and supercomputing help crack this code of a bunch of digital data that supposedly has some biological meaning in the sounds encoded in it? Well, today I'm going to talk about 3 little stories. They're each projects that our lab, the Kitzes Lab, has pursued that have used a combination of supercomputing on the Bridges-2 cluster and some powerful AI and machine learning methods to discover something about nature that we otherwise would not have been able to do without the power of this new technology. And so I'm going to tell a little story about intelligent sound recognition. It's really going to feature the power of GPU nodes, which is really one of the resources on the Bridges-2 cluster that we use the most frequently. Then I'm going to talk about this really interesting use case where you don't even know what you're looking for, and you kind of have to probe the unknown with something called one-shot querying of embedding spaces. And in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about the extreme memory nodes, which are another resource that we wouldn't otherwise have access to without Bridges-2. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about really high resolution tracking of the spatial locations of birds. And for this, the hardware is actually a bit more traditional. It's just CPUs, but what the cluster computing allows us to do is parallelize this at a scale that we would never otherwise accomplish. So let's jump in. Part 1. It's going to be fun because we get to talk about owls. I love owls. Owls are great. And this is really, from the ecological perspective, a little story about seeing the bigger picture through this large-scale monitoring that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see if we were just doing traditional survey methods. So I'm going to, let's see, I don't know if I'm going to be able to play sound for you guys. We're going to try it out because it'll be more fun if I get to play audio of the birds. Let me know if you can hear this when I play it.
Sort of.
Sorry? Did that audio come through?
I heard something.
A little bit.
Okay, let's try it again.
Make it louder, maybe. Oh, yeah. It's definitely an owl.
All right, so if you were able to hear that sound, that's the hooting of a great horned owl, which is the species pictured in the background here. And it might be a familiar sound if you've spent any time kind of in the forests of the Northeast after dusk. They're not very common, but once in a while you might hear this really beautiful great horned owl hooting. Now, the second sound I'm going to play, though, is something that you maybe have never heard before, which sounds quite different. So let's see if we can get this one to play. All right. Did you guys hear that loud screeching sound? So that screeching sound is actually the sound of a juvenile begging call. And so this is a call that the juvenile owls are making when they're asking their parents to feed them a little bit. And why should we care about these screeches if they're such a rare event on the landscape? Well, what's interesting is like we know where the adult owls like to spend their time. We know the habitats that they like to use because it's relatively easy to go out and do a survey where a person stands there and listens. And maybe only 1 of 10 surveys you hear an owl, but if you do enough, you'll start to understand the types of habitat preferences that these owls have. So because of that, we know that oops, there we go again. Whoa. All right, can we get the next slide? Here we go. Right, so because of these surveys, we know that great horned owls are using these mature forest habitats. So in Pennsylvania, we have the system where some sort of disturbance like fire or clear cutting will open up an area of habitat, but over time, you get maturation in what's called ecological succession. And the types of habitats that these owls like to use are really these mature forest habitats. But the question is that same type of habitat the type of habitat where these owls would like to raise their young? And we could just assume it's the same scale or the same types of habitats. But because these events are so rare that you would hear a juvenile begging call in the wild, in-person surveys just really never pick this up. And we just have to do our best and assume like, well, maybe they're using the same habitat as the parents. Now, of course, this is where our automated sensing can come in and help us with achieving a much larger scale. So Lauren Cronster and JT Larkner are 2 collaborators on this project. And JT was able to deploy recorders across the entire northeastern United States. So just an incredible scale of data collection. And they recorded data for an entire season. And so this resulted in a very large data set, over 100,000 hours of audio. And Lauren was interested in analyzing the data to find both the adult and juvenile owl begging calls. Now, unfortunately, if Lauren had just wanted to listen to all of it, she'd have spent 133 years listening full-time, 40 hours a week, before she got to the end and would have some information about where juvenile owls like to spend their time. So clearly, we need to automate this process and apply some machine learning and supercomputing so that we can quickly process these 100,000 hours of audio and extract some useful information. So the way that we tackle this problem in our lab is that sound originally is just a digital signal, so it's a waveform. But there's an interesting representation of sound that will make it a lot easier for a computer and even our own eyes to extract some useful information from that digital signal. And that's called a spectrogram. So a spectrogram is a visual representation of an audio signal where we put frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And the intensity of the sound is the darkness of the pixels. So we can actually see there's a bunch of different sounds in this Pennsylvania recording of songbirds. And the goal of our machine learning algorithm is to take this image and do some computer vision tasks so that it can recognize the different shapes as different species and tell us, for instance, there's a black and white warbler in this section of the recording, and there's a Kentucky warbler in this section of the recording, there's a wood thrush, an ovenbird, a redstart, a hooded warbler, and you can see how this can become a difficult task because there's a lot of sounds happening at the same time in this audio. Now, the type of machine learning that we generally apply to this is called supervised classification, and specifically, we're often using convolutional neural networks or sometimes transformers, which are 2 architectures that are popular for classifying sounds in image data. So in Lauren's case, her goal was to train a machine learning model that would recognize both of these sounds, the low-pitched owl hooting calls and the higher-pitched juvenile begging calls. And this is a task that requires a lot of computing power, and in particular, it requires GPUs, or graphical processing units, which are these chips that greatly accelerate the rate of training and applying machine learning models. So for a sense of scale, oh, here we go again. Okay, sorry about that. So compared to a traditional CPU, or the type of core that a traditional laptop would have, a GPU is going to be about 40 times faster for training and applying deep learning models. So just for an example, training a machine learning model that would recognize these sounds could go from taking 40 hours on CPU to just 1 hour on a GPU. And you might think like, okay, well, like even if it took 40 hours, like, you could leave it there for a weekend, you'd come back and you'd have a model. But the reality is when Lauren trained this model, she had to do it as an iterative process, because her first model, she trained it, worked okay, she found some issues, had to train a second model, find some more issues, and keep iterating until she had a model that would reliably detect these sounds, even if they're very rare, which adds an interesting challenge, because you don't necessarily know if you're detecting all of these rare events. But in the end, Lauren came up with a really nice model that was able to detect both of these sounds. And she actually was able to detect not only the adult calls, but also the rare juvenile begging events in the audio, allowing her to study the habitat needs of these juveniles compared to the adults. And the results were really interesting. She ended up finding that unlike the adults, the juveniles were actually preferring to spend their time in these open habitats, these younger, early successional habitats, indicating that, to have successful owl reproduction and to have the full life cycle and a population that's going to maintain itself, we need a diverse array of habitats where the juveniles can spend some of their time in these younger forests where maybe they're finding different food resources, while the older owls are in these mature forests. And the really interesting thing about this is it highlights the importance of this huge spatial and temporal scale that we can achieve with the automated recorders. You can imagine that because and human surveys are just limited in time and space, we were really only detecting these more common events. And it was only with the application of machine learning to those 100,000 hours of audio that we were able to discover the habitat preferences of these more rare events that are really critical to owl reproduction. So that is the end of part 1. And just kind of going back to the title, it takes a landscape to raise an owl. So it's really interesting to see a different picture emerging from using these new sensing types to understand these rare events. The second story I want to tell you is about frogs in Panama. And so we're going to come back to this frog that was on the title slide here. And this is one of many species in Panama that went through severe declines around 2006. So there's a global outbreak of a fungus called the chytrid fungus in amphibians. And in 2005, this fungus had not arrived yet in Panama, so a stream would have been a noisy and bustling habitat with diverse sounds, over 30 frog species. But around 2005, this fungus arrived in Panama, probably due to amphibian pet trade. And in the following years, the chytrid fungus, known as BD, totally decimated amphibian populations, and one species after another went through drastic declines. Many of these species are extirpated, and we don't even really know if they're still alive or if they're completely extinct. But researchers who worked in this system continued to study the frogs even after these declines and continue to this day to go search for them. And over time, they found that streams that were initially, after these declines, completely devoid of amphibians, gradually there were frogs that would reappear. And these frogs, one year after another, would seemingly reappear from what they thought was extinction, indicating that there were possibly remnant populations of many species that we weren't sure whether they were surviving or not. So as of today, fast forward 20 years, there's still many species we don't know whether they're gone forever or what's recovering and what species we might eventually rediscover. And so our lab's approach to this problem of trying to figure out what rare species might be surviving in what locations is to deploy acoustic recorders because each of these species is making unique sounds that we can recognize. Now, this type of problem presents an extremely challenging scenario for machine learning because it's unlike the problem I talked about with the owls before, where we have plenty of examples of both the rare and common things like the juvenile calls and the hooting. In this case, we actually have very few recordings of many of these species. And one of the things about training supervised machine learning models that you'll often hear about is that they require lots of data. They require lots of examples. So we couldn't take the traditional machine learning approach of trying to discover some of these lost or missing species with the traditional supervised machine learning approach. So the question is, how would you discover the presence of these sounds for species that you don't even know if they're present and have very little information about? So in machine learning, this is called a few shot or one shot detection problem, where you might have one or just a few examples of the sound you're looking for. And the technical solution, or one technical approach to solving this problem, is through what's called querying an embedding space. So an embedding space is a representation of sounds and their differences created by the machine learning model. So in this example, the colored dots represent different species in this two-dimensional representation of how the model is separating the differences in those sounds. So you can see that sounds of a particular species cluster with each other and further away from sounds of other species. So we can use this to our advantage when we don't actually have recordings of a sound we're interested in by applying models that have already been trained to recognize, for instance, bird sounds to this new problem of for instance, understudied frog. So the process is basically that we create these embeddings, these representations from the machine learning model for all of the unlabeled data that we have collected in the field. And then we generate an embedding vector. So we find the location of our single example that we're looking for in this space. And we look around it and we say, what are the most similar sounds to this one in our data, and are any of them actually the sound that we're looking for? Now, the challenge with this is that we're searching over so many different little audio clips at once that it requires a huge amount of memory as your data set becomes bigger and bigger, because this is all of the data that your audio recorders have recorded. And so this is where we were able to scale up the analysis from just kind of a subset of our data to entire field data sets using extreme memory nodes on Bridges-2. So these extreme memory nodes provide way more RAM or running access memory than is available on typical nodes. And we're able to load up this entire data set and query it very quickly for sounds of interest. And the result is that we actually can give it a query of a frog we're interested in. And the most similar vectors in that embedding space are often examples of that same frog that we're looking for. So we applied this strategy to a critically endangered frog that hadn't really been seen at our study sites in several years. But it's thought to still be, persisting in some areas in Panama. And we queried the embedding space for similar calls to this one call example that we had. And most of these results were empty because this frog, if present, is going to be very rare, so it's not surprising. But actually, one of these top 5 results that I'm showing here did have a faint vocalization of this rare species that hadn't been observed at this site in several years. And just 5 samples out of these millions and millions of clips so far we've found that had this rare event. But that was enough to let us know that this species is present at one of our sites. And the following year, our team members who were down at the site actually found a living in the flesh male of Atelopus varius, and we're able to confirm the presence and study that species at that site. So this just provides an example of how we can use these kind of non-traditional embedding methods to search for species in our audio recordings that we don't even know if they're present, and we have very, very little information about, not enough information to train a typical machine learning model. And our hope is that we can keep applying this strategy to other species in Panama to figure out what species might still be present that we don't even know about. The only way that we'll potentially conserve the remnant populations of these species that are existing somewhere in some corner that we haven't explored yet is by first discovering that they're there and then working to preserve their habitat. So it's exciting that we have an approach where we can start to locate these extremely rare sound events that we have very little information about as a starting point for the conservation of these species on the brink of extinction. Okay, I have one more little story. I titled it "A Day in the Life of a Warbler." I'm gonna take another sip. Okay, so up until now, I've been talking about finding out basically where species are located. Is a species here or not? Are the great horned owls living in this forest patch? Is the endangered frog living in this stream? And in the history of ecology, many studies have focused on this type of just presence or absence data, because that type of data is feasible to collect in a rigorous manner with traditional survey methods. But scaling up our data collection with automated sensors, AI analysis, and supercomputing allows us a new opportunity to dive much deeper into the fine-scale ecological processes that go beyond just presence or absence. Over the course of a 10-minute period, this Blackburnian warbler might fend off an intruding male, then court a female, then warn surrounding birds of passing hawk, then probe the boundary of his western neighbor's territory, and then spend some time eating or feeding babies. There's so much that's going on, and a lot of it we can actually keep track of with sounds if we know where the species is going and what vocalizations it's making. When we start tracking individual behaviors, movements, and vocalizations, we can study organisms and ecosystems at a level of detail that's kind of hard to even imagine right now because we've never had that type of data before. So how are we going to collect this type of rich information on location and time? If we go out and do human surveys to track or catch birds, it's extremely time intensive and really disrupts the life of these birds. So again, we want to turn to remote acoustic sensing, this time with a little twist that allows us to capture this fine scale spatial information. And that twist is automated acoustic localization. So what I mean by this is that when birds produce a sound, it's going to travel out spherically in all directions. And if we can record that sound in multiple positions at the same time, we can actually triangulate the original position of the sound source just from those audio recordings and precise time of arrival information at different sources. So to give you a picture of what this would look like, a bird would produce a sound at a specific position, and then we would have audio recorders kind of placed in a pretty dense array around it so that several recorders are picking up the sounds of a single bird. And we know that the sound arrived, at different times at the different recorders based on the time that it takes sound to travel a specific distance. And we know the positions of the recorders. So we can use a very similar algorithm that's used by GPS satellites to locate you on the globe with a GPS unit to localize the position of this bird. So we did this in Pennsylvania this year, in the last couple of years, and we put out this array of time synchronized audio recorders. So a 200 by 200 meter grid with 50 recorders on it, pretty dense spacing. And that's a little picture of our AudioMOS with the onboard GPS there, and the GPS allows precise time synchronization. And we took nice and accurate measurements of each of our recorders so that we know the true positions that will help us localize the positions of the birds. Now, obviously, locating the positions of birds on this grid is going to take a little bit more in-depth processing than just detecting the birds. But the first step is the same step I showed you with the owls, which is that we perform deep learning classification to detect the sounds of interest. But we're going to apply this to every species that we can find on the grid. So not just one species or a couple of species, but every warbler and every cardinal, every grosbeak, and every scarlet tanager, all of the species that are occurring in our grid. And again, we're going to be using GPU nodes that really accelerate this process. But what happens next is that we have to go through a few stages of different signal processing and grouping of all of these detections, where we estimate the time of arrival difference so that we can eventually localize the sounds using that GPS algorithm. And this step in particular of finding time delays requires that we do a cross correlation of two signals, but we have to do this pairwise across every pair of recorders that we're using to localize the bird. Remember that we have 50 recorders, so there's a lot of pairwise combinations and many, many detections of songs. So we quickly get in a scenario where we're doing tens of millions of cross correlations. And so the cross correlation is something that a CPU can do fine, but when you have that many of them, it just combinatorially explodes and you would spend years waiting for your algorithm to finish. So what we do here is we apply what I'm calling ultra parallelized CPU. So the Bridges-2 system has CPU nodes with 128 cores. You can fire up a couple 128 cores and parallelize this task of estimating cross correlation across many, many CPUs, and suddenly you have a very tractable computational task of localizing millions and millions of cross-correlated sounds, or cross-correlating millions of sounds, and then localizing perhaps thousands to tens of thousands of individual songs of birds. And the result is pretty amazing because whereas doing this process without machine learning would have required a lot of time labeling and intensive kind of manual effort to get just a few localized positions, this approach allows us to scale very quickly to tons and tons of localized positions. So what I'm showing here in green are the localized positions using this automated approach for 6 species across that grid that I deployed earlier this summer. Excuse me. And you can see right off the bat that there's all kinds of interesting spatial patterns happening with these species. So for instance, American redstarts seem to only be using the habitat up in one corner of the array. Common yellowthroats, there seem to be these very dense little territories that birds are defending and kind of staying within those territories. And all this information is just from a single day of singing activity. And so all these patterns then become even more complicated as we scale up across the season. So next I'll show you an example of the same thing, but this is another colleague of mine, Tessa Reinhardt's grid, doing a similar method with a few different species. And you can see on the left that these activity patterns and the territories of each of these birds are shifting over time and over dates. So you can see the aggregate kind of territories forming across the season on the right, but you can also see these dynamics playing out between individuals and over time on the left. And really the takeaway here is that this data is so much richer than the types of information that we usually gather during surveys. We can study things like the movement rates of birds, the songs, the activity of individuals, the interactions between one individual and another of the same species. We can study interactions between species. We can even start to look for individual signatures in the songs of individual birds that might allow us to tell the difference between a single, for instance, male yellow warbler and its neighboring male yellow warbler, just on properties of the song. So this is a novel and unprecedented data type that we're really just starting to explore. But I'll show you one more example of this from another member of my lab, Lauren Chronister. So this is one of my favorite pieces of work that my lab mates have been doing recently. And so she had a very similar localization grid where she was studying song sparrows. And song sparrows, as you can see on the left, have different songs for each individual. And So you actually can start to get to know individual song sparrows based on their song characteristics. And not only can we tell the difference between these songs, but we can also teach a machine learning algorithm to separate and recognize these different song types. And this process is actually very similar to the one I showed you with the Panama frogs, where we're using an embedding space. So this is a representation of how similar the machine learning model thinks these sounds are. And here, Lauren has colored these dots by song type. And so you can see that her classification of song type aligns very well with the model's interpretation of what songs are most similar and different to each other. So this ability to separate individuals by song opens up an incredible amount of different directions for using acoustic monitoring to go beyond just what types of habitats are species using, or where in the world is a species or isn't the species. Now we can do things like count the individual birds and see if they return in the following season, or see how their territory shifts over the course of a year, or even see if there are certain properties of songs that females prefer, or that result or are correlated with higher fecundity or higher success of raising offspring. So there's so many different directions we can go as soon as we start to dive into these individual level behaviors that are accomplished through this time synchronized recording array and tracking the birds around. And yeah, with that, I think that's the end of my third story. And I just want to say once again that it's really been exciting to see how we can combine these different emerging, technical capabilities that are provided on the Bridges-2 cluster, like the GPU nodes, the extreme memory nodes, these super huge nodes with 128 CPUs, and really allow that to scale up our work to a degree where we can start detecting extremely rare events, or we can start doing these extremely computationally intensive tasks to track wildlife at fine scales. With that, I'd like to thank some collaborators here. So my advisor is Justin Kitzes at University of Pittsburgh. He's phenomenal, and our lab has grown a lot over the last few years and is often hiring. So keep an eye out for Justin's job postings if this work is interesting to you. We use the Bridges-2 system a ton for compute, and we also use the Pitt Center for Resource Computing. Something like that. I didn't quite get it right. Computing Resource Center, maybe. My funding comes from National Science Foundation and Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And then I want to give a few shout outs to members of the Kitzes Lab whose work I featured here. So Lauren's work was the owl work. Sasha and Santiago worked on the frogs with me. Louis has been working on the localization tools a lot. And Tessa Reinhardt was the one who made one of those localization grids I showed you day by day. And Jeffrey Larkin was responsible for the massive data collection across the entire Northeast coast that resulted in the owl data that I showed you. So with that, thank you very much for hanging out with me and listening to a little bit of our work. We have about
10 minutes.
14
12
minutes, 10 minutes.
13 minutes.
for
Thank you,
fast
Sam.
questions.
This was
Thank you.
fantastic. So I don't know if you can see, there are some questions here. Riaz, are people unmuted so they can talk, or? So anyway, Sam, maybe you can take a look at the questions there. So we have one from Ken. That'd be the first one. I don't know if you can see.
So maybe that question is in relation to the time of arrival localization of the sounds. I was very worried, especially because we're doing this in a forested environment, that the sounds would be bouncing off of trees and that would affect the time that they arrived at different microphones. It turns out that kind of all just comes out in the wash, and there's a lot of redundancy in the system. And so what we do is we do this, replicated many, many times between different sets of recorders, and we just toss out the ones that are the least self-consistent, and the ones that that are remaining are often very accurate localizations.
Ken does that. Great, thank you. And then from Dimitri, for the extreme memory case, can you analyze part of the data from disk, or do you need all of it in memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is possible to just kind of chunk this task up and stage it and do it in disk. It ends up being slow, and not just because you have to read data to and from the disk, but also because the libraries that have been optimized for this type of embedding vector search are optimized to use embedding libraries in memory. And so there are people who are working on optimized approaches for kind of more of like an SQLite, like a SQL-based database for vector embedding from disk. But all of the best fast tools right now are assuming that you have your arrays in memory.
And if I may ask, roughly, do you know how much of the 4 terabyte memory on an extreme memory node you actually use?
Yeah, I was using up to a terabyte of memory.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if that answers the question, but so we have a question from Troy. How do you handle points in time in the data where more than one species is creating sound at the same time point? Or is there at the same time point? Or is there some other background noise taking place? So like, how do you isolate? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a couple solutions to this. The first one would be in the classification sense, actually, you can have multi-target classification. So you can actually have image recognition models that are recognizing even when species are overlapping with each other. And it's not too bad at that. But another approach is that you can actually try to separate your audio stream into distinct sources. And so there's a really cool open source model from Tom Denton at Google that allows you to take an audio signal and it tries to separate out the individual sources. And then you end up with much cleaner kind of bands of audio, one per source. It's not perfect, but it gets a long way to that end.
Cool. Then we have 2 questions, or 1.5, from Mario. Says, first question says, did you have to create an LLM that could screen or summarize characteristics of interest?
Actually, yeah, we haven't used LLMs for this. We're mostly using convolutional neural networks, but the embedding space created by a convolutional neural network that was trained for a species classification task actually can be applied to a novel task with new species and new sounds, and still does a pretty good job of separating out those sounds in the embedding space and being some sort of measurement of the similarity of sounds.
And then another question, how fast is a cross-correlation iteration?
Yeah, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. If you're interested in trying something similar, I could go look it up. Just send me an email. So yeah, my email is sam.lapp@pitt.edu, and I'll throw it in the chat here.
Yeah, put it in the chat. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
Great. Then we have a question from Anna. Says, vocalizations are coming mostly from males. What happens with females? Is this a shortcoming of this approach?
That's an excellent question. So from the biological side, it's true that mostly male birds are vocalizing and singing in particular. And so we might not be capturing the presence of females. What's interesting is that the auditory methods of surveying birds, where you're just listening for birds, is actually the same method that's been used to monitor wildlife historically. So even if a person goes out into the field and does a point count, about 90% of the detection, maybe even 95 if you're in a forest, are coming just from things you heard. And so you're usually not detecting female activity. And so there are, various ways to think about that. One is that you just think about the fact that, okay, we're really studying male presence. We don't really know the female presence. We don't know what habitat they're using. But sometimes if you have a little bit of data on the sex balance, you can estimate the total number of individuals based on that sex balance and the number of males you detected.
Okay, so I guess somebody needs to come up with a different method or approach to um, to also check on the females. But then there's a question from Navodita. What is the area that can be covered by a recorder or such device?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends a lot on how loud the bird that you're interested in is, right? And how loud the background sound is in that environment as well. But typically, we can record for a radius of about 100 meters for most birds.
100 meters, okay. Follow-on question from Ken. Thinking about the owl results, if the juveniles and the adults are preferring different habitats, how useful are the begging calls? Or are these habitats close enough for the adults to hear?
That's a great question. So it's likely that the juveniles, the adults are also around when the juveniles are making those begging calls and they're in the proximity. But the adults might not be making those hooting sounds in the same habitat. So you could imagine that the hooting sounds are for attracting a mate, for defending a territory. But then you get to this stage in their life where they're raising the babies, and the babies are using these open habitats with a different food source. The parents are around, but they might not be making the sounds that we were picking up with that hooting model.
Great. And then Fabricio says, how was developing a multi-processing stage for spectrogram computation for large-scale data sets? Did you consider Python libraries such as Numba?
Yeah, that's a good question on the technical side. So we're using PyTorch for machine learning, and we use an open source Python package called Open Soundscape that myself and my lab develop that's specifically for deep learning and bioacoustics. So Open Soundscape under the hood is using packages like SciPy and Librosa and PyTorch to do the computation. Yeah, there are ways to speed up the spectrogram computation with GPU, but actually the scenario that we usually end up in is that we're passing all of the machine learning tasks like the forward and backwards pass of the CNN to the GPU. And at the same time that those tasks are happening, we have maybe 10 or 15 parallelized CPU workers that are preparing the next batch of samples, including creating those spectrograms. And so that ends up being a nice workflow to keep things moving fast.
Fantastic. And I think this will be our last question that we can do live. And then after that, you'll have the Sam's address, and please feel free to contact him. But Mario's asking, so a YouTube video of a similar project in Africa studying elephants. They use self-supervised learning to distinguish what is possibly identified names. Can you talk about what the process of understanding the insights the learning models return? Yeah, I'm not sure, but yeah, what Mario means.
I think I get the idea of the question. So like, can we get at some more deeper meaning that's happening in the language beyond just like we know that the species is there? What information are they conveying in that? And that's a whole active area of research. And so for some species, we have an idea of what certain sounds mean, but there's a lot more to be learned on that front. And that's where these like high resolution tracking systems with localization will really go a long ways to help us dive into things that we haven't really even explored yet as far as the way the animals are communicating.
Well, and that's where the petaflops in your title is very appropriate, because we all hope to grow and be able to do like 2 years from now, 5 years from now, stuff we couldn't even envisage today. So
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you
so
all very much. Thank you very much, Sam. This was great. And as I said, next week, I guess, the recordings should be available on our website. And thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Sam.